Hello again, it's the Employee of the Month, and I wanted to speak to an issue today that is of great interest to me, and it's the intersection of science with theology and philosophy. And also, as a side venture, I'd like to speak to the ideation of scientism as a way of knowing. Science, really, the first thing I've got to say is, and I say this as a believer, obviously, thank God for science. The fact that I'm recording this right now and it's going, if we didn't know anything about quantum mechanics, I wouldn't be recording this right now. It's being placed on a tiny little microchip wherein thousands of semiconductors, millions of them probably, have been etched onto the surface of this very thin wafer of silicon. And the fact of the switching that takes place, it takes place at the quantum level, particle level. I don't pretend to understand that, but obviously without science this wouldn't be happening here today. There'd be something else going on. I've got lighting in here that is LED, so it's not hot as compared to, say, a halogen or some kind of incandescent lighting. So thank the Lord for science. We need it. And I'm going to say that science is one of those disciplines that God has set the human race toward. It's not something that is antithetical in any way to Christianity. Some of the greatest scientists we've ever had, of course, have been believers, Christian theists. So science in and of itself and within its practice, proper practice, is really a moral and ethical neutral, truthfully. It has no moral or ethical component in its actual practice. The actual practice of the experimentations and the studies and the theorizing and the hypotheticals that are brought up and the inductive reasoning that goes in, and then all of the demonstrations that are used to demonstrate what the theory actually said, such that, like with Einstein's idea of gravity bending light and Eddington looking through the telescope and proving that during an eclipse, all of those elements, they are morally neutral. Take, for instance, this. A husband and wife team by the name of Fieser, Mr. and Mrs. Fieser, who developed synthesized the coagulating chemical in blood. Well, a hemophiliac was pretty happy about that. The fact that there is a synthesized chemical that they can utilize to keep them from bleeding out with a disease that heretofore had been one that hardly anyone could live with. So we owe them something in that respect. Fieser also developed napalm. Well, napalm had a different purpose. It wasn't to save lives, it was to burn property and people. So we see that science as a raw pursuit has raw utility. It's a worthy pursuit. And it's a worthy pursuit even apart from the pure utilitarian uses of it. In other words, I believe science is worth doing even if it doesn't produce something of a concrete nature, even if it simply produces a knowledge base, because as we have seen throughout the 300 or 400 years of what I would call modern science, we see that some of the theoretical, some of the things that were thought to be true and then gradually became shown to be true have embellished our lives. This microchip upon which I am recording these words is a case in point. There's a problem, though, and the problem is not really the intersection of science and theology and philosophy. I don't see that as a conflict. Some do. I disagree. I don't think there's a conflict. We can make it one. We can certainly do that, and I think this is where the tension actually lies. Science is a way of knowing. We're talking now, of course, in the realm of epistemology. Science is a way of knowing. It's an epistemic grid, an epistemic structure. And it's a good way of knowing when it comes to certain domains. I mean, let's face it, reading Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism is not going to help somebody in their pursuit of quantum mechanics or cosmology or immunology or embryology, or you take any of the scientific disciplines. Reading Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism is not going to help very much. Reading Spinoza's musings about his view of the divine is not going to help very much. Reading Soren Kierkegaard or any other philosopher, modern or old, is not going to help us in doing the science. That's true. And in those realms, science is a superior way of knowing. Its domain is the empirical domain, the experimental domain, the demonstrable domain, and its tools are induction and theory, hypothesis, experimentation, peer review, verification, all of these elements, just like with Einstein's theory of gravity bending light and Eddington's proof of it. Science, however, has limits, and this is where the conflicts actually begin to surface. Sir Peter Medawar, writing back around 1984, I believe it was, wrote a book called The Limits of Science, and in it he said, science can tell us a lot of things, but there's some things it can't speak to at all. Like, why is humanity here? What is the meaning for life? Where is life going? What are the origins of our meaning? Morality. Science can't speak to these things. For instance, you take a weapon. Science the technology can be developed to create a weapon. Science does that. The atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb. Those are weapons, but science can't tell us whether it's moral to use them at all. So there's a limit. Science in its natural practices has limits. Now, I'm not trying to pick on anybody here, and I hope it doesn't come across that way. I recently read Lawrence Krauss's book, A Universe from Nothing. And I don't want to get into the dispute about nothing. His book uses nothing, and I'm going to say in an almost metaphorical way. He probably would say a scientific way. Well, the problem is nothing in its normal usage is the absence of anything or non-being. And that's not the way he uses it. He uses it to describe a something that is pretty near nothing. That's fine. I leave that to the scientific domain. It's not interesting to me particularly, and plenty of people have commented on it and have called that particular point into question in that way. I'll leave that for them to do. And I do want to say something about Lawrence Krauss personally for me. I have great affection for him in the sense that he emailed me back. Now you think this is a person who shows up on television all over the place. I would call him somewhat a luminary, and he's certainly a luminary in the fields of cosmology and particle physics. I emailed him with some questions. He emailed me back twice, and I will forever have affection and respect for that fact. But in some of the writings and in some of the things that he speaks to, he disdains philosophy because he sees it as a useless endeavor, not producing anything like science. Science works. That's one of the phrases that comes out, and it does within its domain. Stephen Hawking, another great physicist and cosmologist, wrote the book The Grand Design, and in it he says philosophy is dead. What I find fascinating about both of these books, and I have not read Hawking's book except excerpts from it, I've read Lawrence Krauss's book pretty carefully, and in it what I find fascinating is they are both philosophical tomes, both of them. They declare philosophy dead, and then they proceed page after page after page to propound philosophy. You see, here's the difficulty. Once the theory and the experimentation is done, once we leave the calculus and we leave the place of the experiments to prove something, and we write something out in common language to explain the concepts to a wider audience, we have left the realm of the scientific. We've now entered the realm of the philosophical. Pure and simple. So science steps over a boundary in that way. I don't see that it's avoidable. I don't think it is avoidable. I think if the scientist is going to leave the blackboard with all the calculus, unless they're just going to publish a paperback that shows a long 30 or 40 page equation and shows the beginning, the question, and then the result, and says, see, here's what it means, they're not going to be able to communicate to the wide audience because 95%, I don't even know what the percentage would be, most of us don't understand the high-powered mathematics. I certainly don't. And that brings me to the next point here at this intersection between the scientific and the theological, philosophical. Theology has limits as well. So does philosophy. I know there's a trend right now, and there has been for some time. This is not new. I've only been a Christian for 34 years, but I have seen this trend throughout the history of my lifetime as a believer, a theistic Christian, that there are those who are engaged in the work of the apologia, that is the answer back, the apologist. I would consider myself part of that category for sure. And we tend to use the scientific to demonstrate the theological. And we say, see, the science bears out what the theology has always said. I get kind of queasy with that. I'm not saying it's never right to do that. It may be that there are places where the scientific would speak to that directly. I don't know. But I get a little queasy with it for a couple of reasons. Number one, I don't understand the science necessarily. I can understand Lawrence Krauss's book because it's written in language I understand. But the science that gave us that book, I do not understand. I don't understand the mathematics. Sean Carroll can write a book about the universe, and I don't understand the mathematics that he did in order to draw his conclusions. I might understand the conclusions, but I don't understand the mathematics that got him there. It's interesting to me that there are so many different versions of the mathematical representation of the mechanics of the universe, its origins, how it got to be where it is now, and the descriptions of gravity and everything else. There are so many versions of that, which tells me something. Science is coming up to that cusp of limitation. Now, when it comes to the limitation on science with regard to technology, I don't think there is one. I think as long as the technological and the theoretical intersect, we will continue to push the boundaries of technology onward. I'm very thankful for that. We've all benefited from that. However, there is going to come a point at which science is going to meet a barrier. And I'm going to say cosmology is that place for sure. I would say biology meets a barrier as well, but cosmology certainly has. Cosmology looks at the present and it sees how things work mechanistically all the way down to the particle level here now, and it has to extrapolate based upon what we know of the universe, the observable, and say, well, this is how it must have come to be. This is how we think it came to be. That's a valid induction. That methodology is totally valid for science to do. I'm not critiquing that. I am going to say that there's going to be a limit. And that limit is, we're coming up to it, I would say, with regard to cosmological extrapolations to the past. Because we're going to come to a place where there's no experiment to be done. And all we're left with is the present and the theoretical. And we use it to look back as best we can. And we're going to come to a barrier where there is nothing. Now, the universe could be eternal. That's true. But then even in its eternality, it still cries out for an explanation for that eternality. The physical universe cries out for an explanation. And it does no good to set forth things like the multiverse and things like that, because in the end, they cry out for the same explanation of the observable universe. And there's a barrier, because there's nothing to do an experiment upon. Theology has a limit also. Theology, we endanger our validity when we as apologists or theologians extrapolate from the scientific into theology and say this is how God did it. The reason I say that is it does two things. One, it reduces God to a scientific quantity, and that he is constrained within the physical universe to operate within it in a certain way. I reject that. The second thing it does is it places us on the shifting sand of science. Science is not the same. Even in my lifetime, we've had 3 iterations of what the universe is. On the one hand, it's eternal. On the other hand, it's oscillating. And on the third hand, there's a beginning. So within those 3 iterations in my little short lifetime, things move. And those movements leave us in a place where I think apologists do a disservice in some respects, saying things about the scientific that they do not really understand. They may. I mean, some of the apologists that I read and listen to, they may well understand the science and the mathematics involved, such that they could actually be cosmologists themselves. I don't know. I know I don't. But there are things worth understanding that science cannot expound. There are things worth understanding that theology cannot expound. And when science steps over that limit, and especially in the science of origins, they come to a barrier with the scientific, and behind that barrier I can only see it being one thing: metaphysical. That places us squarely in the realm of the theological and the philosophical. And as a matter of fact, if you look at cosmology at its limits, at its extreme limits, it comes across, I mean, I'll just say this for what it is. Lawrence Krauss's book came across to me as a book of analytical philosophy. It didn't come across to me as a book necessarily of cosmology, even though that was the subject matter. But the way it's written is extremely philosophically analytical. And so we've got an intersection there where theology steps over a line and science steps over a line. Science is a way of knowing, and it has superiority in certain domains. It is not the absolutely superior way of knowing anything, because it can't tell me anything about why I love my wife. It might tell me about pheromones, it might tell me about neuronal firings in my brain, it might tell me all of these things, but it won't tell me why I should love my wife. So in that, there is a limit. And I think, personally, I love science. I don't see myself in conflict with science at all, whether it be in the science of the origins of biological life, the science of the origins of the universe, none of it. I don't see myself in conflict with it. What I do see is that the conflict arises when each of us from the two disciplines step over boundaries and try to use disciplines either as a way of dismissal of one or the other, or as a way of buttressing our position. I think both of them are dangerous, and they get us into territory where conflicts do arise. So I would say to a Lawrence Krauss, do your science, and thank God for you. I would say to a Stephen Hawking, do your science, thank God for you. I would say even to a Richard Dawkins, do your science and thank God for you. But I would say to all of us, both scientifically minded and theological and philosophically minded, let's at least have the humility to say that all the disciplines are valuable. Let's just be honest here. It's not important to a scientist to understand the mechanics theologically of God's aseity, his self-existence. It's not important necessarily. A scientist can do their work, a cosmologist, biologist, doctor, they can do their work without considering that. That doesn't mean it's unimportant to everybody. And let's be honest too from the scientific perspective and say it's not important to the person out there who's doing their political work in the area of policy to know that the universe is 13.72 billion years old, or that light travels at a specific speed. It's not important to them to have those facts straight, whether it's the Copenhagen representation or another representation of quantum mechanics means nothing to the person who's doing their political work. We've just got to admit that, and yet all of the disciplines are important. All human disciplines are important. They all contribute. And I've said this before, and I'll say it today in closing. What scientist can exist were it not for the farmer? Grandma knows how to make a biscuit. Maybe we should celebrate the fact that the scientist does not when the scientist sits down to eat Grandma's biscuit. The scientist benefits, Grandma benefits, and all of humanity benefits. I think we should step away from it with some humility as Christian theists, as theologians, as scientists, and say all of these disciplines are important. Yes, where they intersect, we can have a lively discussion about it, but in no way does one eliminate or diminish the other. Victor Stenger was wrong. The conceptual space for God is still with us. no matter what Victor Stenger has said, or Lawrence Krauss, or any of the rest. And we have been wrong when we have taken the science and said that the science somehow defies what we believe as Christian theists. There cannot be a defiance there. If God does exist, there will never be conflict between what we can discover about the physical universe and what God has said. Can't happen if he exists. Something we need to keep in mind. Thank you so much for your attention. This is the Employee of the Month. Until next time.